So there's a lot of conversations. I still want to go forward with the previous topics that I was going to cover pertaining to Israel and whatnot, because there's some theological connections to that. But because there's just so many different conversations going on, and I just kind of want to keep the pace with it. So among various things had been the discussion in the U.S. or with various politicians pertaining to Native people and our relationship with the government. And so in some of our state politics, there had surfaced this discussion, which is a common reoccurrence among the tensions historically that have yet to really have more of a, I guess, like breakthrough in terms of the government-to-government relationship between whether it be the state or the federal government and U.S. tribes. Of course, there's a lot of progress that's been made, but at every stage of progress, then you have to negotiate the stage that you're at and to reestablish the grown relationship and whatnot. And so what we're kind of finding, among numerous things, in this stage of development and government relationship is, it seems that in practice, what people are making reference to. So here's the thing is, there's a lot of people that are just so much better at doing the, whether it be the logistics of paperwork or the actual protocol and procedures of negotiation and all of those things that have to take place. I think for me, my place in it is to try to sort through and help sort through and do my part in the public conversation. And so, you know, people can say stuff like, so-and-so is not an expert on this, that, or the other. But at some level, the public conversation has a usefulness in the way people talk about things. And so if you can pick up on the way people talk about things, there's a lot of belief behind those types of approaches. And so there is a place for people to be in the public conversation, collecting the way that people are talking about things and trying to help interpret them into what does that mean in how people are representing their communities or thinking about it or believing things about other communities, and how does that affect the way people vote, what they think, how they perceive others and whatnot. And then if that is the case on, you know, like taking a snapshot of the public perception, whether it be true or not, because there's a lot of various perceptions, right? Then how does that then translate into proper policy and negotiation, right? So I think for me, I just tend to follow a lot of the perception of how people talk about things, what it seems to suggest and what they mean, what they think they know about other groups and whatnot, and then we try to negotiate on what that means, right? At the end of the day, you know, like I keep saying, it is I tend to be an optimist, so I try to select for what is good for the greater population, some type of universal human rights and whatnot. But in the midst of it, you come up against some difficult obstacles, and so then we kind of have to go into some difficult territory there on what does it mean, and then how can we establish an actual breakthrough. Among a variety of topics that had recently come up in terms of the political sphere and how it's perceived politically, and then how that's perceived in various political mechanisms of protocol and whatnot, had been the discussions and the public awareness or ideas surrounding tribes in relation to taxes. And so among just some tribal communities lately or recently had resurfaced this theme about taxes and whether tribes pay taxes. And so then it really did also surface these conversations and clarity on taxes and the assumptions about tribes and their participation in the economy and the various ways by which allocations occur and relationships with the government. You know, so these had started to surface again in terms of the political sphere and in relation to tribes, and trying to clarify along those lines. So also pertaining to this topic then is the other associations and assumptions and whatnot that also seem to coincide with the federal government and government entities or different political parties in relation to tribes, and what the assumption is that they think tribes expect, right? So there's all of these things. Anyway, that's kind of like in the backdrop of my mind as well. And so let's just say, for the most part, I tend to think there is a lot of area for like tangible progress that can be made as to what tribes, like how they're approaching the government-to-government relationship that we have, that our status is. But anyway, along the lines, though, is this question. So people that follow politics, one of the questions that surfaces is when they talk about land acknowledgement, right? People are somewhat aware that nowadays in the networked communication, when people are making reference to, like hosting various conferences or what have you, there's this increasing practice across the nation where people have land acknowledgements. And so land acknowledgements are where they will publicly proclaim that they, are hosting their conference on the lands or the territories of, and then they'll, say such and such tribe. Because the idea behind that is that basically all of the United States or the Americas is developed on ancestral territory of tribes. And even if the reservation boundaries are a smaller portion representing the tribal nation on a reservation, ancestral territory goes beyond the reservation boundaries. And so there's this increasing practice where people are acknowledging that, like, we are hosting this conference from the ancestral lands or territories of the such and such tribe of, this place or that place, right? And so in doing that, it's kind of raising this awareness where it's putting it in the consciousness of minds where people are realizing, all of the Americas is ancestral territory of certain tribes, and regional resources that are like written into certain references of tribes and whatnot. And there's just a lot of clarity that's seeming to come out in terms of like a lot of research and claims and ideas that people have had about tribes and whatnot. As like while we're talking about it, there was also these other like historical claims about tribes and doing behavioral assessments and whatnot. I found it interesting because it kind of it seemed to start from some point of like making it seem as though tribes were kind of like wild in the sense of not really having like social behavioral standards, not really having certain protocol, like just wild people close to cavemen and whatnot. I just thought it was interesting because one of the things about tribal nations is that we have like our tribal stories and legends, and some groups won't even really make reference to them titled as legends because it goes beyond legends. A lot of them are like the stories are kind of written into the lands, and so they also document, they're a type of oral history that also documents geographical territories, and it tells in story certain historical events and whatnot. So there's other connotations to the stories. They're actual recordings of history and whatnot, and behavioral dynamics written into story form. And so it goes beyond just a legend. There are aspects of it being entertainment and a legend and a certain craft of storytelling, but there's like a way by which the stories are written into the earth, I guess you would say, because even in a lot of like tribal nations, in the language, when you study the language, and I'm just relaying a lot of information, there's so many other people that are way better situated and more specialized in these topics. I just try to summarize in general, and then other people are just like really great at kind of breaking it down and explaining it more. But what I'm getting to is this notion that within the tribal stories is documentation of history, and they are basically kind of, in a sense, recording directly geographically to land bases. And so within the languages are also words and portions of the words where we, in our very being, like our body, in reference to descriptions of ourselves, are a lot of times said in such a way through the language that ties us to portions of the land. So portions of the earth are written into the way we describe our bodies. And so there's this sense where parts of our bodies are parts of the land. And then even in the stories, parts of the stories of which we describe and record history are directly associated into the land. And even along those lines, like there's, like I was saying, like there's certain aspects of the stories that function to produce various outcomes. For instance, like transference of knowledge, religious ceremonial beliefs, documenting relationship of the land, documenting history, entertainment, like there's a certain craft to it, a variety of things, spiritual effects and whatnot, behavioral dynamics. And so something that's also interesting is that the stories are actually very, very old. Some of the ones that we have now are like summaries of it, are shorter versions of, like longer form of stories and whatnot. And so what you also find, though, in the behavioral dynamics is that there is a lot of complexity to the behavioral dynamics. And it doesn't suggest that people didn't understand or have an awareness of certain complexities of interactions of relationship. It doesn't suggest that people were just like wild animals without, any type of cohesiveness to community and stuff like that. And that there was dynamics in the story that were very relational, that could differentiate between like improper grown powers and like diffusing improper power, improper power mechanisms and whatnot, and selecting for or telling stories of contention between groups and de-escalating those types of contentions and whatnot. So we're kind of getting into all of these things, right? Like the misconceptions throughout history of Native people and whatnot. And so it then kind of goes into a lot of these other conversations and topics and influences of where we're at now that we all kind of have somewhat of a voice, and we've created a pathway to be able to, at least to some degree, put some type of backing to this voice, some type of footing, and being undergirded enough to at least start having somewhat of a necessary conversation. Then we're finding these things surface. And so I don't see that as a negative thing. Even though it's a difficult conversation, I see it as like, in some ways, even though in the midst of a lot of difficulty, which it just sadly seems like that's what happens, is also in the midst of it, these opportunities to have these discussions and whatnot. And then in some ways, like this window of opportunity necessary to have those discussions so that we can hope to go forward in the future with some type of improved benefit, right? So that even the cost of the difficulties of all of this can have hope that we go forward with something to be improved and something better. And so in the midst of that, then we have this reemergence of these conversations, these topics, the intersecting of these things that are coming up, and then we're hoping to be more equipped to answer them, to de-escalate, and to have something productive to go forward with. And so in light of that, then there's just a lot of things surfacing, a lot of conversations surfacing. And so let's just imagine one scenario where people say, well, imagine in the future that tribes just evolve and then it kind of assimilates into this shared living space. Let's just imagine that. Along with a lot of world religions, imagine everybody today in 1,000 years, it'll look so different. And there'd be this enmeshment and evolving and whatnot. I mean, that's what it seems like people think time will just... Because it gets so contentious, and I admit it gets contentious and wearisome for us to be in continual world conflict. And so For me, I want to try to remedy that. I'm not trying to just go into things to make it more difficult or have upheaval for the sake of it. I tend to want to remedy things if they can be, and I just tend to think that they can be. But it does kind of make a mess of things as you kind of go along. And so anyway, I think I'll talk about that later in terms of like taking a theological approach to that. Among other things, among some other like cultural approaches and perspectives. But anyway, let's just say hypothetically speaking, this idea that people in practice seem to think that over time, if we all just kind of like mind our own business, hopefully over time it'll correct for itself. And in 1,000 years, everybody will kind of be meshed together and we'll have this cohesiveness, right? Let's just, like, even if that happened, even if it was the sense and then it ends up being that we all live differently than we do now and we all have to change, or something to that effect. Even if that was the case, I still tend to think that it's important to have these conversations because the way that it changes. So this is kind of how I see it. I still think there's room for the advocacy and the principles that Indigenous people are bringing to the table. That's why I talk about it. But also under the surface, what's behind it and how I see it is doesn't serve the world system to not make these corrections. There's tension because the system in itself needs to make those corrections. Let's just say because it kind of becomes like described as though like these contentions are just making it harder for everybody else. And let's just imagine we all disappeared. We're not, challenging the system anymore. The system in the way that its trajectory of success is the sole survivors, and they're the only ones that have survived. Let's just imagine that happens, right? Nobody's bothering the system. Nobody's challenging it. And it's just left to its own devices to do its thing. And the issue there and the problem there is that in and of itself, the standard by which it's created does not align with the way that God was revealing unto humanity to align. And so in and of itself, then it wouldn't then produce that corrective measure unless it would continue to, as it persists in that standard, piece apart and keep generating those that don't fit within it. And so that's part of the issue that I'm saying is like the standard in itself actually is in error. There's something skewed about it. And so in and of itself, it's not generating the ability to go forward, even if it gets rid of all competition or all pressure or any kind of challenge to it. And so what I'm also saying is that the challenge is because it's not quite there. And so us together having this tension are helping to produce the necessary challenge that's needed for, mutual benefit. And it would, like, the storyline there is that it would tend to keep reproducing that tension. And so that's what I also see is that it just doesn't fit or reflect the way that we're supposed to be living, amongst one another. So then we can be reincorporated back. We don't have to disappear. Now we're back. So then, though, the question is, how do we then have a beneficial conversation, utilizing these tensions, allowing the tensions to reflect, bringing together something that's constructive and not just, destructive of, various ones and whatnot. How do we do that? And what are the mechanisms to do that? And what does it look like? And how are people also themselves trapped in it? And, it kind of goes back to those topics about like Martin Luther King and other ones made reference to is that we all live in an inescapable mutuality, and what affects one affects the other, and to some degree, right? The way by which our networked system is, the economy, resources, we all live downriver, that kind of effect. So to some degree, like we live in this shared space among the earth, our bodies are built in the very imagery, whether if you look at the very indigenous development by which where we all come from, our bodies are a map of the type of land regions that we come from. We're a mixture of those. And so our bodies are a reflection of the diversity of the land. And so we have this inescapable connection as earthlings to the land and the natural economy and the interconnectedness and these various factors. And so how do we then look at the system by which we live in, our personal mechanisms of our body and our life in relation to a shared connection on the earth? And in a lot of ways, that's what the indigenous cultures make reference to, is on a basic level, what is that connection? What is a better system by which we can have our, similar universal human rights and needs met, and also living within a sense of stability and sustainability within our natural resources, and also in line with the growth and development of different stages of our life and experience, of which we also all enjoy, because every system and social structure at some point in time would have expanded out and then grown into complexities of relationship, as we could see in a lot of the shared indigenous stories and documentation across the earth. And then what does that mean as we try to understand a shared standard of understanding God in the midst of the spirit by which we live and function, and then can better increase along the complexities of these grown networks? And so I guess what I'm saying in the long run is I just tend to think that at base level, there is a beauty in indigenous culture and what they bring to the table. There's also room to, as we refine some of those spaces, to expect that we'll grow in relational evolving properly as we do that. And so what I'm not saying that I'm against the idea of evolving or modernization and whatnot, but to get into a proper alignment with it. And it could be expected that over time, it eventually looks profoundly different over time as we evolve along the lines of the way that we should be evolving. And so, anyway, I guess I hope I kind of explained a little bit. I guess what I was leading into, though, was that argument that I was making, that something within the system needs to be corrected, because that in the skewed portion of it, even though there's good there, we all exist today because there's still good and there's still things to preserve, but there's still corrections to be made. And so it's kind of differentiating between those things and recognizing that even if the tensions go away, like, that correction still needs to be made. And so it's valid to be having these questions and conversations. And so that's kind of what I'm saying in terms of it is valid for people to be trying to make these corrective measures. But anyway, I have to go for now. Still are some things, though, to talk about in reference to in practice. Then what does it mean when it seems as though this impossibility, what it seems to make reference to when people talk about land acknowledgements, is that they kind of say, well, if people are making land acknowledgements, then does that mean they're going to give the land back? And then other groups will say, let's not do land acknowledgements because, basically there's no intent to give the land back. And so then it turns into this conundrum, right? Why say it? It's under the surface. What kind of approach can we take? So then it starts to seem like what people think in practice is, and maybe for some groups that this is what it seems, is that there's no way to really reconcile history, that we have to have a starting point going forward. They'll tend to think that it's this forever contention within religion, where it has kind of framed it into seeming like you give the land back and then go along with this certain other alternative form of belief in God and religion and culture, or try to defend this idea of this opposing version of God and this conquest narrative. preserve the land and justify the land pertaining to certain counter-oppositional beliefs, which usually include maligning various cultures and trying to villainize them to make it seem as though there was justification in conquest. And, so then it goes round and round, right? With the assumption of the religious rhetoric, there's only one way and it has to go through Jesus and da-da-da-da-da, and Judeo-Christianity and the conquest narrative and divine right to the land and, such and such, right? So people that follow these topics kind of understand what it seems like. And this is also another example as to why I approach this coinciding with all of these various factors, how it affects people politically, the, effects on the land, the cultural representation, and the religious interpretations as pertaining to God and whatnot. Along those lines, I tend to think that corrective interpretations actually do provide an ability for, still adhering to this ideal of God, and then still being able to make proper forms of political negotiation among people groups, in terms of universal human rights and such, and as pertaining to the land. And it doesn't mean that in the meantime, as we grow those types of networks and have that type of stabilizing of people groups and representation and whatnot, that there has to be this type of relinquishing various historical claims and whatnot. As though it's this idea of, okay, we'll make these concessions and agreements if you relinquish like historical claims. I don't think that it requires people to do that. It just seems to require that people understand some level of ability to go forward with some kind of shared common goal. And in the midst of it, then, as people are integrated into, mutually integrated into that portion of like agreement and whatnot, that then over time there can be corrective measures, and it would be then better situated in the future to make continuous negotiations from that point of people having a stake in the system and having some level of representation within it. In practical terms, then, it seems like it would involve stuff like some of the things that the tribes are trying to do, like integrate some of their history and their name and awareness of who they are as a people into the public education, and equip their students to be able to, their tribal students and descendants and members to, during their allotted time of being educated during the day, to have it incorporate understanding about their history and who they are, and equip them to be able to represent their tribe in these government-to-government relationships. And some of the common standards that people can then appreciate is the standard of stewarding the land and protecting our natural resources and making sure that we manage them well as pertaining to the people that live on the land. And over time, you can kind of imagine, I'm really generalizing stuff here. I'm just kind of like putting words to a little bit of what I do kind of feel like I've talked about this before, but just kind of reiterating some stuff. There's just a lot of things like in the past that I've already deleted because it just kind of gets so compiled. But you can imagine then over time it puts into place the ability for the corrective measure to be implemented and aligned over time. Because some of the very basic agreements that were attempted to be made was that people had their allocation of land, that the government then adhered to those shared agreements, and then including it would also be the preservation of land and like the cultural stewarding of the land and expectations of transparency within the justice system and proper, due process and, just some of the basic measures of justice and those types of standards and mechanisms and abilities for access to basic sustainable living and still working out what that looks like and how that looks in the ever complex modern system that we all have to, at this rapid pace of development, expansion, and global network have to kind of resolve for and kind of keep up with. And so it affects everybody in terms of the pace of modern life and what that continues to look like. These things had also been concessions where there were certain areas of like negotiation for natural resources, and then the preservation, and then also concessions for areas of other types of development and overlapping developments and investment and whatnot. And so it's really not that far-fetched to also think along those lines that those mechanisms can be established and incorporated and improved upon. I really think, and this is why I continue to go back to the topic of religion, I really think a lot of the blockages that were functionally enacted, even if silent behind the scenes, even when people weren't wanting to bring it up, was because of the conflict of religion and people thinking that they just didn't believe that there could be a sense of a testament to God if people had just simply made the basic aspect of life less burdensome for people. And there was just these mechanisms, like I was saying, of this improper approach for the conquest narratives and whatnot that were making it so that people would refuse other measures of like concession for mutuality and government to government, like more cohesive government to government relationship and whatnot. I just tend to think that it's not accurate to hold that type of belief in God and then block or create barriers for better cohesive relationships and whatnot. And there's already mechanisms for people to be able to do that. And I also think over time, then it does tend to provide the ability over time in terms of like the land and whatnot, is that there's various ways by which mechanisms of a return to the standards of the land in an indigenous type way is also just adhering to like proper stewardship of the ancestral territories. And so one aspect among various others in terms of land acknowledgement is that people recognize the regional ancestral territory. And what you then find when you do that, take for instance, you say like this cultural region, like there's a plateau, there's certain cultural regions where it's kind of like a general label, say like plateau tribes, but then within the plateau tribal region, there's a similarity of connection to the river and the salmon, but there's also, in like other seasonal round connections, a similarity, but then there's like the individual tribes that are unique, right? So some, like for an example, like one aspect of land acknowledgement is to then say, okay, this is the land region of these people, or this tribe, or these people. What are the stories and understanding of like management of the land? What is the lens by which you could see the love of the land through these cultural frameworks? And then it provides the ability to say, oh, these are the salmon people, or oh, these are the people of the river. Like as an example. And therefore, like a major aspect of natural resource written into the land is the river and management. And so in some ways over time, the return to the land and the standard of the land as pertaining to land acknowledgement is seen through the lens of those regions, the cultural and travel regions, in terms of building a better relationship to that cultural region, and then having the eyes to see the ancestral, like these movements now are like the documentary Gather and whatnot, is to look at what is the natural resources and stewarding of the land for that cultural region, seen through the lens of those tribes. And so another major aspect is to then provide a place for the certain cultural regional representation to be a part of discussing natural resource preservation and whatnot. Even along those lines, that's a way by which over time the land claims can be returned to a standard of relational connection to the natural resources and the cultural standards of stewarding the land in relationship to the tribes and the people that have studied in those regions and built a relationship in certain territories and regions and whatnot. But anyway, there's a lot of other things to talk about. I'm just kind of trying to explain a little bit as to how I kind of see some aspects of optimism in terms of better government-to-government relationships, and that it doesn't seem impossible to me when we kind of look at it in some of these measures that people have done so much work to establish and build these like pathways of representation and political negotiation and whatnot.